Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on building e-learning capability, which is part of ASQA's process of consultation and engagement for its strategic review of online learning in the vet sector, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. My name is Crispe. I'm ASQA's General Manager of Engagement and Education. It's fantastic to be with you this afternoon as both the host and facilitator of this webinar, which will take the form of a panel discussion with our guests that we have with us, and I'll introduce those guests now. I'm very glad to be able to introduce Andrew Shea, who's the chair of the Education Industry Reference Committee and Chief Executive Officer of the Builders Academy of Australia. Thanks, Andrew, for being with us. Tim Rawlings, who's the Head of Training and Product Development at PwC Skills for Australia. Thanks, Tim, for being with us today. Jason Ash, who's General Manager at MRWED Training and Assessment. Jason, thanks for your time. And Judith Keller, last but not least, our very own Judith, who is Principal Regulatory Officer at ASQA. Welcome to you, Judith. So my sincere thanks to each of you, but also to our audience this afternoon for tuning in. Just before we do go any further, I wanted to pay a quick acknowledgement to the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the people, cultures and elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present today. Before we start the session, I did want to go through a few basics just in terms of how the webinar will work this afternoon. In terms of audio, you would have joined the session using your computer's speaker system by default. If you'd prefer to use your phone to listen into the webinar, you can do that. If you select telephone in the audio panel, which is part of your main control panel, and you can receive the dial-in information that will be displayed there to do that. For this webinar, all participants will have their audio muted, so you should only hear either myself or the panel speaking for the duration. Today's session will run for about 60 minutes. We will try and be quite organised with the timing. In the first half, you'll hear a bit of an introductory briefing from each of our panelists, and then the second half will be reserved for a Q&A session, which will invite your participation into. You'll need to submit your questions by typing them into the questions panel, which is part of the GoToWebinar control panel there. So please enter your questions there in text form, and we'll make sure we can capture those from there. Unfortunately, we're not able to answer questions specific to individual situations. So if you can please keep your questions broad and relevant to the entire audience, that would be fantastic. And of course, we can always take other types of questions in a different forum offline if need be. So from experience, we will get quite a lot of questions, certainly with the audience size. So we will aim to group them where possible into themes, so we can cover off on as many as we can at the one time. So we'll be doing that in a live setting as they come through in terms of collating them. If we can't get to all the questions, ASQA will still very much consider them, and we'll try to weave those into our thinking as we go forward with the strategic review process. So they certainly won't be lost in terms of lines of inquiry for us going forward. And there will also be a survey after the webinar today, so you'll have the opportunity to let us know what you think and submit any questions that you may have on future topics of discussion. And finally, I should mention that this presentation or webinar is being recorded today, and in the coming days, we'll upload it to our website, which is the ASQA website, and send you a link to that so that you can have a look at that and also send it around to your networks. So by way of a very quick introduction before we get into the session, it's obviously an understatement that this year has been a very big year for us all. It's been a time of immense challenge for the sector and disruption for that matter. And I think many in our audience today will be aware that from last year, 2019, ASQA has commenced implementation of a range of reform initiatives. Toward the end of last year, you started to see some changes in terms of what we were talking about to the sector and how we were communicating to the sector, and very much around some of these changes that we're looking at both on the regulatory side of house, but also in terms of our approach to education and engagement. And of course, COVID then hit and very much had wide-sweeping implications for the sector, and particularly around all of the work that we're all trying to do to improve quality in the sector as we go forward. And between March and July this year, more than 1,000 of you advised us that you had some of your training delivered online, or you're in the process of moving to delivering online. And of course, I don't need to tell all of you the scale and pace of that shift, which was of course significant for all of us. So in terms of ASQA's response to that, our response has very much been multifaceted, as I just touched on. It's included the development of extensive guidance material to support providers in shifting and managing with the changes that COVID has brought us. And in large part, that's been reflected on our website in terms of guidance material that we've published on there. As a regulator, ASQA's had responsibility to ensure the quality of vet delivered to both domestic and international students remains at a high standard. And to that point, the purpose of our strategic review in online learning is to very much understand the opportunities and risks of online learning in the vet sector, and to ensure that our regulatory approaches remain effective in responding to the changing environment that we all operate in. So through the review, we will continue to monitor the impacts of the pandemic on providers and students and employers and across the sector more broadly, and seek to identify and share information that will support continuous improvement in the quality of vet through the sector. This will include extensive consultation, one of which is of course what we're doing today to start that process, and there'll be further opportunities for consultation into next year. So to that end, this webinar is very much the starting point for that discussion, and we are fortunate, as I mentioned a moment ago, to have the speakers that we have with us today. So to get us started, our first panelist is Andrew Shea. As chair of the Education IRC, Andrew is going to share some of his key insights into the genesis of the new skill set, as well as sharing his experiences as a provider, and also maybe to touch on a little bit around the future and what that might hold as well. As a member of ASQA's stakeholder liaison group, Andrew has also put his hand up to be part of a working group that will support the strategic review, and that'll enable him to help provide ongoing guidance to the review team. So Andrew, again, a very warm welcome to you today, and I'll pass over to you. So you've got 5 minutes, and I do apologise in advance to all our speakers. I'll need to enforce the times today. So Andrew, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. Really good to be with everyone this afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity. So I wear a few different hats, obviously chair of the Education IRC, non-executive director with ITECA, the independent peak body, and part of the ASQA stakeholder liaison group. And I want to start by acknowledging how proud I am to be part of a sector that has had to show resilience during this really difficult time. And I know that a lot of the activity where providers have moved online, where that wasn't their traditional model, that's due to their business continuity in trying to minimise disruption for their students. One of the AISC responses as part of their rapid response to say, how do we potentially need to change training packages? How do we need to change practices within the industry to deal with particularly physical distancing restrictions that were in place in Victoria, probably more than others, my home state, was to actually say, well, what are the skills needs that are not current in training packages right now? And one of the ones that fell with PwC Skills for Australia, and particularly the Education IRC, was a development of an e-learning skill set. Now, there's a few questions that always come up, and they've come to the IRC regularly. One is, why is it an AQF level 5? So what we did was we said, for the ease of getting something to market that's suitable for online facilitation, online delivery, let's have a look at existing content. And the easiest solution for that was the best fit to get it to market, to offer solutions to providers, was the design, develop e-learning resources and facilitate e-learning. So that makes up the skill set that's recently been delivered or recently been released in the deliver e-learning skill. Now, if you think about your own business, and I know myself, we've got 65 trades trainers. Now, trying to train some of them on how to deliver online, there's some key methodologies that we've had to ensure were constant through everything that was being conducted. And we started by saying, this is not a diluted process. This is not a matter of, well, bad luck, we're part of a pandemic, it must be just the best we can do. We said, well, what is best practice? And the first thing we did was actually have all of our trainers watch webinars like this, watch a number of sessions. We actually had 3 presenters come in, including from MRWED. We've got Jason speaking today, which I'm very, very much looking forward to say, how can we impart best practice and say, what do we like as learners? My business, particularly with trades, it was challenging with kinesthetic and tactile learners to ensure that engaging mode and make sure there was very detailed structure and session plans and methodology to how to interact live with each student. From a IRC perspective, when we had a look at the skill sets that would add value to the sector, the first one being the deliver e-learning skill set. We understand there's self-paced online learning, there's virtual classroom, there's blended learning or flipped classroom. Saying online does not actually mean specifically all context. So we're very conscious of saying, how do we build that capacity of a current workforce, but also a future workforce? Because every organisation I speak with is now saying, gee, you know what, some of our students actually really enjoyed that. And survey from my organisation last week of over 2,000 students, we had 84% of students who had to move to an online format actually say they wish to stay with it post-COVID. Now, that doesn't mean they can complete all assessment tasks or they can demonstrate some of the practical assessments, and that's something I know Judith will speak to today, but it actually shows that if you get the learning methodology right and the experience, you can actually deliver a good product and your customers judge with their feet, I suppose. And that's something that as a strong community of practice in our sector, I'm really proud to be part of. And the next stage of the IRC work is looking at how do we then assess better online? How do we make sure that we're covering the rules of evidence, the principles of assessment, and making sure that we are maintaining the integrity of what we're delivering, maintaining the experience of our students, and ensuring that there's clarity for all trainers, teachers, facilitators through the sector, whether that be enterprise, independent, TAFE, not-for-profit, and make sure they have those skills to give best practice and maintain the strong reputation of the vet sector in Australia. I'll leave with that, Rob, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards.
Thanks, Andrew. That was great. Appreciate you keeping the time as well. Fantastic. And I'm sure there's you've touched on a number of really crucial issues around the methodology and assessment and whatnot, which I'm sure we'll tease out further. So, look, without further ado, I will hand over to Tim now to provide his introduction as his role of Head of Training Product Development at PwC Skills for Australia. So, Tim, over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, and thanks, Andrew. And for the benefit of those on the webinar today, our role at PwC Skills for Australia is a skills service organisation who is there to service the Education Industry Reference Committee as part of the National Training Package System. And as some of you may know, we're responsible for 9 different industries and 17 different industry reference committees. And Andrew's given a very good overview of what the background and intent behind this particular project was, but I can probably sit it in a broader context of how it came to be in the response to COVID that the National Training Package System implemented this year. As we all know, in March and April, when things started to lock down and COVID really hit, the Commonwealth Government and the ministers in all of the states, as well as the Commonwealth Government, were keen to make sure that the national training system responded as well as it could and did its job in terms of making sure that those affected by the pandemic had the skills that they needed in order to get jobs in the recovery, but also wanted to make sure that the sectors themselves were able to keep training staff, because remember, this pandemic was different to others in the sense that many industries, they simply needed to adapt rather than necessarily having a uniform economic impact. And so we were asked by the AISC across our different industries, what can we do in a national training package system to try and help make sure that the right training is available for people at this time. Andrew alluded to the fact that we first looked for existing units of competency, and in the education sector, in the vet sector, it was clear that one of the biggest shifts, the biggest shift really, was the fact that learning had to move online. And we were pretty clear pretty early that this wasn't going to be something that was just going to be a 2020 phenomenon. It is something that has been happening for a significant period of time, and it is something that I think coming out of the pandemic, as Andrew alluded to, is going to stay with us. And so the IRC moved very swiftly to make sure that we looked at what we could in the National Training Package System, and therefore we developed this first skill set on e-learning. The reason that we chose the units themselves was because they were existing. The timeframes were very tight. for all industry reference committees, including the Education Industry Reference Committee. We were on a very tight time frame to make sure that we could get these new products into market and allow people to use them as quickly as possible. And so that meant that the process of writing new units of competency or amending units of competency was probably out of the equation. When we submitted our proposals to the Australian Industry Skills Committee, they came back and said, yes, we agree there should be a skill set on e-learning, and we went about doing that, but they asked for a second phase of work to be done on a gap in the training package, which was around e-assessment as well. And so that will require new units because there weren't existing units that specifically covered e-assessment. And so having submitted the e-learning project a few weeks ago now, and it's now up on TGA and ready to use, we are now going through the process of beginning a project on e-assessment. And while I have the floor with the 512 people here, I would encourage you to get on skillsforaustralia.com and keep a track of that project, because it is a project which will go over the next few months as we go about developing a unit or units on e-assessment to go into the training package to better reflect the needs of industry. I think one of the key things that came out of the process was that people are extremely engaged in this topic. There were a range of different views on how e-assessment could be embedded into the existing training package structure. A number of people think that this is a fundamental part of training for trainers and assessors in the system. And so in future training package updates, we will consider how we can make it more prominent in the system as well. I might leave it there, Rob. I've noticed you've given me my bell, but more than happy to answer questions when we finish the opening statements.
Many thanks, Tim. And again, you've touched on I think some important features there of how your work with AISC and other stakeholders in that mix is so crucial to getting all of this really right. So thanks for your insights there, Tim, and we'll certainly come back to some of those. Jason, over to you. So conscious that you've heard a few perspectives now from Andrew and Tim, but very much keen to hear your views from your perspective at MRWED and the work that you're doing there. So over to you.
Thanks, Rob. And thanks for having me along as well, folks. As the other gentlemen have alluded to, it's a great privilege to be part of such a project like this. I think our perspective, or my perspective on this, is a little different, obviously coming from the provider side of things. And our experience in this space is not just connected to COVID. So we made a strategic decision in the business just on 3 years ago to close our head office and run the RTO remotely. So a lot of the lessons that we've learned in the last 3 years have put us in a better place through this COVID situation to be able to respond quickly and keep making those changes. And we've been delivering our courses through one form or another in an online space for well over 10 years. I think the big thing that changed for us was the way our students responded to this. And I think pre-COVID, we had a very defined sort of group. There were those that liked the idea of self-paced learning through an online portal because that's what they like as a learner. And then we had our lion's share of our students would choose face-to-face as their primary delivery method. And obviously with COVID, that changed quite significantly, and we've seen a huge switch in that space. Interestingly, as Andrew said with his organisation too, we've been quite surprised how many people have made the change because they had to, but have actually really enjoyed the experience once they got there. And quite often the feedback from our students in that space is that was much better than I expected, or was much less an impact to my learning than I thought it was going to be. So for us, I think that was a real key milestone. And actually, as Tim mentioned, our original response to some of these things was COVID related, but we very quickly realized that this is not just about this year in COVID. This is going to be part of our journey now, much, into the next few years, I guess, in that space. Even with some of our international students that historically wouldn't engage in online environments are now asking for it as something. Can we develop more content? Can we develop more training for them in that space? So a little different for us. I think the other experience for us is that the introduction of the skill set has been really important, I think, in the journey for TAE trainers and assessors. We've been running professional development in this space for quite a long time, and we've been running webinars on webinar presenting for a number of years. And it's nice to see that moving from more of a PD opportunity into more of a formally recognised training and assessment pathway. And I think that puts our trainers, particularly those that are at the front line during this period, I think that's going to arm them with better skills and knowledge and really help us drive the industry forward into a new year of change that's coming out of it. So as I said, our perspective is slightly different, I guess, not so much historical data in that space for us, but an exciting journey moving forward. And overwhelmingly, as I said, the feedback for us has been very, very positive in this space, and looking at using technology to support what we already had was probably the biggest change for us. So rather than running fully self-paced type online courses, we've been using a lot more things like what we call facilitator-led Zoom sessions and structuring our training more around short, sharp content delivery opportunities, engaging the learners and then giving them that next stage of work to take away, coming back, revisiting, and then building a pathway through those mechanisms.
Thanks, Jason, for that. And I think you made some really salient points around, very much the fact that online learning or using the online platform is not necessarily a new thing, but building on what Tim was saying, that perhaps some of the drivers for the shift forward are different this time around with COVID and other things. Thanks for your insights there. And look, just a very quick reminder to all of our attendees, if you can just include your questions in the chat box rather than put your hand up, that would be very much appreciated. Thanks. Well, last but not least, Judith Keller is one of ASQA's most experienced regulatory officers and brings a wealth of experience in observing provider practice in online learning. So, Judith, thank you for your time, as mentioned before. I'll hand over to you now to provide some perspectives of your own in terms of how we might achieve best practice in e-learning.
Thanks, Rob. It has been quite remarkable observing training providers rapidly transition to e-learning during COVID and throughout the pandemic. But I probably need to acknowledge up front that it hasn't been possible for all training providers to do that, and particularly where the training has involved the acquisition of practical skills or the use of specialised equipment. So whilst we have had a number of training providers that we're aware of that have transitioned to e-learning, there have also been others that haven't been able to for those reasons. But looking across providers, I guess there's two types of expansion and I guess enhancement of delivery that has occurred. The first has been for the providers that really hadn't been delivering in any electronic form or using any online forms of learning prior to COVID. For those particular providers, the transition has been significant. And previously, where providers may have talked about online learning or considered it to be too hard or too expensive, it's pleasing that we're now actually hearing some of those training providers talking about the considerations around which digital or online tools they've chosen to use as part of their delivery and the reasons why. And certainly a common theme in the experience of those providers has been the development of the e-capability among their staff, and this has been particularly crucial for facilitating their ongoing communication with their students and to make sure that their interactions are meaningful and that they actually support learning. The other providers, or the other group of providers, I guess, are those that actually have learning management systems in place prior to the pandemic. And what we're aware of is that in those particular instances, the providers have often actually had a look at the functionality and the capability of their existing learning management systems and have expanded the use of that capability to effectively augment what they were doing previously. And it's affected a shift from students' individual and I guess isolated interactions with learning materials and the activities and the assessments that may have already been sitting within the learning management system to being a much more interactive approach to the training that's provided. And in addition to that, we've also seen significant additions of other forums for group communication, such as private groups, particularly for learner cohorts, where these are hosted using other social media platforms that students are already familiar with and are using in other areas of their lives. And of course, many training providers, whether they're new or experienced in the e-learning space, have rapidly adopted the use of real-time or synchronous communication tools such as Zoom and Skype. And they've used these predominantly to create virtual classroom learning environments. So certainly a key theme that's been observed is the practice of training providers moving towards creating, expanding and enhancing social learning environments. And during the pandemic, this has obviously been fairly important in terms of mitigating the impact of social isolation that's been experienced by many students and trainers, of course, for the first time, and of course has kept many students connected to their learning. Anecdotally, it's also evident that because training providers have expanded their use of technology and media and online tools, many have also been able to offer more individualised and just-in-time type learning experiences and interactions with students than may have occurred previously. So, for example, trainers may be uploading additional resources or providing additional resources to learners in response to the interactions that they've been able to have with them in the online learning environment. And similarly, to, I guess, create connections between learners. So, for example, learners with existing industry or workplace knowledge or experience being encouraged to share this with other novice learners. And we've seen this in areas such as aged care, where we have some existing learners in the workplace, but the novice learners haven't been able to access the workplace, but there's still been able to be communication and interaction between those learners who may be undertaking the same course of study. With respect to, I guess, some of the key considerations for achieving effective practice in e-learning, many of you who are on the webinar today would be aware of the research report, Online Delivery of VET Qualifications, Current Use and Outcomes, that was released late last year by the National Centre for Vocational Education and Research. And that particular report highlighted many attributes of good practice with respect to distance delivery, e-learning, and also online learning. And from a regulatory perspective, many of the aspects that are highlighted within that report align with the compliance requirements around Standard 1 of standards for RTOs, particularly with respect to student support and approaches to training and assessment. And student support is one area where we have seen significant changes in provider practice as a result of the pandemic and a move to e-learning. We're seeing more providers identifying upfront the existing digital skills and previous e-learning experience of their students and also their assessors as well, and using this information to structure, I guess, an orientation for both learners and for trainers about how to use e-learning tools. And some of these, for example, have been developed via video demonstration, also using that same information to establish peer mentoring programs and coaching. Another important aspect which warrants, I guess, further development as we move forward is ensuring that the right tool or the right online digital tool is being selected for the learning experience, and designing learning resources and activities that will actively engage learners, particularly taking into account different learning styles. And in some organisations, we have seen trainers being encouraged to actually work through an online course or the e-learning experience, effectively wearing the hat of the student before they commence delivery to the students. And organisations have reported that this helps to ensure that their trainers are familiar with the course content, but also provides opportunities for reflection as to the extent that the e-learning resources are engaging and promote interaction. Similarly, student support has been another area where we've seen providers use multiple mechanisms and options to support students, including moving beyond traditional approaches such as phone and email through to using facilities such as virtual offices with scheduled times when a trainer might be available online for students to virtually drop in and to discuss matters related to their training. So with respect to, I guess, some of the effective practice that's being reported by ASQA regulatory officers, this generally tends to fall into two areas. One is around what we're seeing as increasing confidence in online learning practice, and also some advances in innovation as a result of providers, I guess, reflection on what they're actually doing. As you will be aware, in May 2020, ASQA presented a webinar on distance learning, which discussed a range of approaches to online and e-learning, particularly with reference to compliance with regulatory requirements. And collectively, ASQA's regulatory officers would have seen variations on almost all of the approaches that were discussed during the May webinar. With respect to compliance, it's been particularly evident during recent months that there is a high level of awareness of these requirements among training providers who are delivering via e-learning. We've also seen increased awareness of the principles of effective online learning, particularly the importance of active engagement for learners, not just passively reviewing learning materials, interactivity and sharing of learner experience, and also to, I guess, teaching presence as well. In some organisations, we've seen trainers working together to deliver programs and to develop skills in e-learning. So even though the trainers might be in a different location, there's the leveraging of expertise within the training team, where trainers are supporting each other to develop new skills in online delivery, through team training sessions, coaching and feedback. We've seen providers using online environments for collaborative problem-solving experiences as a different approach to working with their students rather than just disseminating training and assessment materials. And another interesting development, which I think was probably occurring in the past, but we're hearing more of now, is about industry involvement in online delivery of courses and programs, where industry experts are being included in webinars, for example, to add work-based content and with recording and uploading of that material to online platforms for access by students. And
Judith,
two other areas,
sorry.
just very quickly.
Sorry, Judith. I'm just conscious of time, but I'm excited about what you're talking about there, and I think there's going to be some opportunities for us to get into some of that in the Q&A, if that's all right with you. I'm just conscious that we're just trying to get to the next stage. But thank you so much for talking to us about some of those tools in particular and the approaches that are being taken. That's fantastic. So look, everybody, we will move to questions now. So just to reiterate, as I mentioned before, if you'd like to submit a question, you can use the question pane in the control panel to do so. And so please do that instead of trying to raise your hand. That would be much appreciated. And before we do get into the discussion, I will give you a chance just to find the question pane, just to remind you that we do have a survey after the webinar. So I'd really encourage you to complete that survey, because your feedback is absolutely important to us in terms of making these as valuable as possible and improving for future sessions. So without further ado, I will jump to the first question, if that is okay with everybody. And this one is potentially for Jason or Andrew, in terms of how do you help students use an online environment if they're not comfortable using computers? For example, non-English speaking backgrounds, or people who have traditionally come from perhaps parts of the sector or industries that may not lend themselves to online learning or delivery. So interested in your thoughts on that.
Happy to jump in, Rob. I think that what's really important is that the student is suitable for the training and the training is suitable for the student. I think it's important not to push a student into an online learning environment if it's not for them. Now, the way our organisation does it is via a very thorough pre-training review and conversation regarding existing capabilities across different IT platforms, what systems and software and websites they already use. And then if they're a little bit nervous and it's not very familiar with them, booking in a one-on-one session. And quite often we've used 3 different delivery platforms over our time in the virtual classroom environment. Over the last 5 years, we've matured in that space. A Big Blue Button, GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar, we're now using Zoom. And what we do is, because we have those platforms, we organise a conversation with the student. So what I would say is, as part of the enrolment process, do your enrolment process online via video. That's the best way to get comfort and to deem the capability of the individual, and then put support mechanisms in place, such as we have IT support for every live class that can actually get it. Simply they put their hand up and IT can actually give them a call, even VPN into their computer if they need. The support is actually in addition to face-to-face. It's not an easier mode, It's actually more complex if you get it right. And Jason, I'm sure you've got other points to add.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I'm going to say really the key thing is making sure you've got the suitability right first. Because there are times there that the student may feel like they have to pursue this pathway because they're getting pressure from their industry or their workplace. But if they're not a good candidate, then they're not a good candidate. And there's no amount of additional support we can do sometimes that are going to help everyone. But I think the key thing is getting the enrolment process right, checking that they know what they're getting into and that they understand what that journey looks like. We use the terminology of a learning journey at MRWED, where, similar to Andrew, we have an interview opportunity with all of our incoming students to talk them through things like their vocational experience, right down to their IT. Are they Mac users? Are they PC users? And what impact that might have on that learning experience for them. And then for me, I think the most common error, if you like, that I see in organisations I've been asked to try and help in this space is that the design of their e-learning is not conducive in the first place. So they've sort of loaded a new platform with 150 PowerPoint slides, and that's what someone's going to read and then start answering their questions afterwards. Whereas I think when you start to explore that with the students, you find that whether it's online or face-to-face, maybe it's the collaborative learning that drives them and that's what they want. Maybe it's the opportunity to discuss and review with other people, that's what they want. Neither of those things are exclusive to online or face-to-face learning. It's about then building the systems to have that available to all of those different learners. And that's something that we try and do a lot of.
Rob, I might just quickly add, as chair of the Education IC that also has foundation skills within it, I would really encourage RTOs to have a look at the foundation skills qualifications in digital literacy and the capabilities they can help their learners actually gain. And it may be a core business area that you look at where your learning demographics are suitable to need that guidance prior to moving into a vocational qualification.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. And I think the other thing we've had a lot of success with in this space is any of our new students that are choosing our facilitator Zoom model, the first session that they attend is how to learn using the facilitator Zoom model. So we spend that first session actually not on content and not on assessment or anything like that, but simply the functionalities, the interactions, the way this is going to work and how they're going to use this during their learning journey to make sure that they're now ready to actually take on the content rather than simply delivering content before they actually understand the mechanism and know how to interact with it. So that's been quite helpful as well.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Andrew. So this is a question that I might start with Tim on, and please others feel free to jump in. What's being done, to your knowledge, to look at augmented and virtual reality technologies in terms of the delivery, and how will they form, or how do you think they'll form part of the learning journey going forward? Tim, did you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, with respect to the training package, I can probably speak, and then I might hand over to Andrew and Jason to answer more broadly. But look, I think that augmented reality is something that in a range of our training packages we are looking at. For instance, in the resources training package, the role of new and emerging technologies was the subject of a project that we've just completed. So, and it's one of the things that in the national system is actually not the most straightforward thing to try and get ahead of a technology and the way that it's being implemented, and then write a unit of competency on it such that it can be trained in the national vet system. But nevertheless, it's something that we try and do. In the learning environment, I think it's something that a future review of the training package would definitely look at. I mean, the way that the training package is written and the way that the qualifications are written, if it is a modern learning tool, then it is probably something that can be accommodated within the units of competency and the qualifications as they are. But if it becomes something that is so ubiquitous or so important that every trainer and assessor needs to know it, or that it should be called out in a specific unit of competency, then we'll listen to industry and the industry reference committee and the AISC will make those decisions accordingly. But I think that just the way that these things tend to find their way into training package systems, we've probably got a few years yet before we get to the point where it's necessarily called out in that way. But Andrew, as the chair of the IRC, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that one.
I think my best example would be what our organisation did, and we're lucky that we're part of one of Australia's largest home building groups, but we've actually gone out and 3D mapped and videoed the full home builds across 6 months of 13 different properties. We then send out our students the 3D imagery of that with a Google Cardboard headset, which are actually quite cheap to send out to your students. They simply pick up their iPhone, put on the headset, and they can walk through any point in a build structure, click on a button, and the builder will come up and tell them that join or the tools they use for that, or the piece of timber they used, and so on. Now, that was something that we had already embedded in our organisation, but we rapidly moved to add another 6 or so when COVID first hit. Now, for civil construction, our trainers during COVID wore headsets, just GoPros, and live streamed to our students to show them when they're on the skid steer, when they're on the bulldozer, etc. It doesn't replace practical learning, but it actually aided in the underpinning knowledge and skills of how to implement it into a practical skill when their students were able to return back to face-to-face. So I think there are some fantastic examples providers are already doing. The technologies we use are not cheap, but day by day, they're becoming more and more available. And things that me and my systems manager looked at 10 years ago now are all cloud-based, easy off-the-shelf products, and something that every organisation should try to increase their learner experience.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Andrew. Thanks, Tim.
And I think one of the things you touched on there for the future of that space, I think it's about getting the costing in the industry being able to afford to do some of those things. I know for our perspective as what you call a reasonably small RTO, I guess, in the bigger scheme of things, some of our technology is just a little bit out of our reach currently, but we've been using, I guess, simplified versions of that, using blended classrooms, using the Zoom sessions where we're being able to bring remote students live into a presentation space and getting them to interact and work with a live classroom. Not quite something we can pre-record yet and put through a headset, but hopefully we can get to that place one day. It'll be a lot of fun, I think.
Thanks, Jason. It certainly would be. Just changing gears a little bit now on the issue of CRICOS and bringing into play some of our international student perspectives. This is a question for Judith. Judith, for CRICOS providers, when do we go back to face-to-face training, and can we continue with online learning? Interested in your views.
CRICOS delivery is of course complex, and it's particularly because CRICOS is also impacted by immigration and visa obligations. ASQA has been working with other regulators, including TEXA and the Department of Education, which, as you know, is the policy owner of the ESOS Act, and also with the Department of Home Affairs in relation to this matter. As the policy owner of the ESOS Act and the National Code, the Department of Education, Skills and Employment are responsible for any consideration of changes to the legislation, particularly in relation to, I guess, the ongoing flexibility around the online component. And it's only due to the extenuating circumstances that we have had and still currently have in some instances, and with the agreement from the department, that ASQA is able to apply regulatory flexibility at this particular point in time. However, for CRICOS registered providers, at least some part of delivery can be offered online for CRICOS students, and that provision is certainly there in the National Code at present. And as a CRICOS provider, we would expect that the provider is adjusting their training and assessment strategy to deliver part online and part face-to-face, and providing, of course, that state authority health regulations allow that. And if a provider is adopting that approach, consideration obviously also needs to be given to the capability of staff in order to be able to deliver in this way. If there is a decision to be taken to end ASQA's regulatory flexibility, there will be adequate transition arrangements put in place, and these will be afforded to providers to ensure that our students and providers are not adversely affected.
Thanks, Judith. And I've got a question here that probably goes to Jason and Andrew in the first instance, but of course is open to everybody. But it's a double-barrel question. The first part of it is, how do you design assessment criteria where assessment requires observation or demonstration on more than one occasion to ensure you meet all criteria. And the second part of the question is, there's a sense out there that online delivery requires a significantly higher time commitment from trainers and assessors, and how has this been effectively planned and considered in terms of pricing for training?
I'll jump first this time, Andrew, if you like. The first part of the question for me is, if it says you've got to do it on multiple occasions, then we need to do it on multiple occasions. So in the virtual space, from my opinion, nothing really changes with those standards other than the evidence collection method itself. So rather than you being the assessor that may be able to be on site to witness it currently, we need to think more about how can I still be the witness, however, when I can't be on site. So we might lean a little more heavily on third parties as long as they're appropriately qualified people. We can't have anyone just putting their 2 cents in, but we tend to drive them towards people that can show us that they do hold the certificate for in training and assessment, for example, to help facilitate some of those observations. We should be able to trust that they have some competency or some strength in observing what we're looking for. So that helps us in that space. And then we use things like we've talked about Zoom or GoToMeetings. I've had some students that have live streamed in on a FaceTime phone call into their classroom and just sat the phone up in the back of the room so that I could see what was going on, and then liaised with the third party that might be supporting what I could or maybe couldn't see in the image, things like that. The second half of that question is, yeah, absolutely. Our experience has been that our online students do need more support these days than they used to, particularly I think because previously people that were choosing the online model or what we deem as the fully self-paced version of it were people that might already have experience in that learning space or have already completed other training like that, and they're a bit more comfortable. Now we have more people that this might be their first learning experience in this methodology, requiring a bit more help from us and a bit more support. From a pricing perspective, that's an organisational decision that you guys will have to make, I guess, on review. For us at the moment, it's a little bit more around, we've been trading out expenses like trainer travel, for example, so reinvesting that sort of expense back into some additional support time, is sort of working okay for us at the moment. Whether that's a long-term strategy or not, we'll see what that looks like coming into next year. Andrew?
Yeah, look, I know that providers have been trying to, partially through self-preservation and a keen eye on student experience, trying to do the best they can. There's some scenarios where no matter what evidence you're able to collect, the training package still requires an on-site assessment. And as frustrating as that is to get to that time, I think that's a key lesson that I'm always having conversations with RTOs on. They're saying, yeah, but if I don't get the student finished now, I might lose them. And it is deeply frustrating, and particularly for our sector that's passionate about student outcomes and quality outcomes, to have them as graduates going on to the careers that they want. It's really, you've got to keep a keen eye on the training package of what it does ask for. I support Jason in the third-party reports, in the collection of evidence via video format as well as via workplace hours. There is a key area there, though, that the workplace supervisor and the third-party individual is not the assessor. The assessor is the assessor. So that's just something that I know all training organisations need to be very conscious of, that they don't say, well, Johnny on his work site said he's competent. And as a provider, we've got over 1,000 apprentices, and it's a conversation I have regularly with workplaces where they're saying, I think my apprentice is ready to be signed off, which is part of the apprenticeship program. And I'll say, fantastic, thank you for that vote of confidence. We'll send our assessor out now to put them through their paces and ensure they can demonstrate all the skills as required through the training package. And they are two separate areas. Regarding the online learning, I agree that it can actually be more expensive, more complex, more time consuming, unless you step back and look at it from an andragogy perspective and say, how do I build a program for online learners? Not just try and flip my content from face to face and say, well, now you're online, good luck. And some providers did have to do that in the short term. That's definitely understandable, but it's a little bit of building a plane while it's flying. What for those providers who've had to do that and saying, great, what do I now need to bring in? Whether it's Kahoot as a as a quiz that they have to do every 10 minutes to get them thinking and challenged against each other. Whether it's Slido as a website they actually put their questions into and other members can vote it up. Whether it's a matter of ensuring every single individual has their camera on. So as soon as they become disengaged, it should be no different than if you had a learner on their phone in the back of your classroom. It's getting them back on track, it's throwing a question at them, it's ensuring they're engaged, and that's why the live and interactive virtual classroom model is something that I very much endorse and our organisation delivers, because you can very much identify students at risk and wrap your arms around the support mechanisms to get them back on track and ensure that the online learning is for them. And that's key to their success and your organisation's success as well.
And
Thanks,
Andrew touched on
Andrew.
there too, folks. I think there's a lot of free resources out there that can support the trainers in that delivery as well. So things like Kahoot and Slido, they're not programs that are going to cost you the world to get that extra interaction as well. I think it's a great tip.
Thanks, Jason. Tim, did you have anything to add there, or?
No, I think that's pretty well covered.
Tim, I did have a question. I think there's about 60 RTOs at the minute who, or that are approved, I should say, to deliver the skill set at the moment. But considering that not all are going to deliver it, or potentially might be getting ready but aren't quite ready yet, is there any advice as to where to look?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so as I said before, these units of competency were existing units of competency. So anyone could have delivered this in the past if they wanted to. I think what creating a skill set does, and Jason mentioned it before, is it gives it a sort of a level of prominence in the general field of professional development and upskilling that potentially it didn't have before. I mean, the TAE is an interesting training package. It's clearly dominated by the Certificate 4, and there are some wonderful units that sit in the elective bank of that qualification and sit in other qualifications in the training package as well that are probably underutilised in my opinion. So I'd encourage people to get on training.gov.au and have a look at the 2 units in the skill set, but also be engaged with the e-assessment project as well. Because what, you know, on behalf of the SSO and the conversations that we've had at the IRC level, I mean, what we'd like to see is this skill set becomes, you know, very well recognised as these are the units of competency that trainers do and assessors in the future in order to declare their bona fides around, you know, being capable to deliver in an environment, in a remote environment or an e-learning environment. We've heard today that it isn't the same. You can't just sort of flip a switch and assume that everyone can deliver in both an e-learning environment and a face-to-face or in-person environment. Clearly, there are core elements or there are overlapping elements between the two, and they're discussions that we've had at the early stages of the e-assessment project. But you know, I think all training organisations who've had to go online this year would full well know that there are challenges to doing this in a good fashion, not just in a fashion that sort of gets you by. So yeah, if you have the units already on scope, you're eligible to deliver the skill set. If you don't, I would encourage you to engage with them and see whether or not it's something that you'd be interested in. We obviously, the way that the national vet system works, we don't have any data yet on how many people are using the skill set. However, anecdotally from industry and just from the way that these things are released, people have been very engaged in the release of this skill set, and I would imagine if they aren't delivering it at the moment, or at least looking very hard at delivering this to their own staff or to other organisations and their trainers and assessors as well.
Rob, if I can just get some insight from the Education IRC. So we're very conscious from an IRC perspective that the Certificate 4 TAE at the moment, being 9 core and 1 elective, is very prescriptive and doesn't necessarily allow for a scaffolding approach of specific skills that a future workforce will need. So a lot of this work as far as developing different skill sets, albeit an AQF 5 level at the moment for where they naturally sit, we will be looking for a case for change to go to the AISC for us to come back out to industry, engage and say what is fit for purpose. Is it more electives in the TAE? Is it more units of competency? Is it more skill sets that we can then put back to ASQA and say that the standards should potentially recognise from purely a facilitator perspective for those in an enterprise context? So please, as Tim mentioned earlier, keep an eye on the PwC website I believe that engagement will be ramped up, particularly over the next 6 months, because it's very much a new norm. And the positives to come out of the challenges we've all faced is a realisation that the future's here now. The online learning, the capabilities our assessors need, the somewhat areas that are antiquated in our sector, and I'm saying that, not the ISE, that we can fast track and we can actually make sure we modernise and bring in these future skills that all our facilitators and staff need.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Tim, for your earlier response as well. That's much appreciated. Look, I'm conscious of time. There was a question I did want to ask Judith. Judith, by way of a quick comment from you on, in terms of the information and evidence and documents that we would like to see from a regulatory point of view at ASQA's vantage point. Are you able to give some insights to our viewers today on what types of additional information would be useful to provide in an audit situation, for example, around online delivery?
Certainly modified training and assessment strategies, and there is a tool that's been shared on the ASQA website by a provider. So certainly to be able to see those. When we're coming to an audit, certainly for the regulatory officers to have access to your online system is most helpful, so that we can actually see what the student's seeing, to see the student's experience. In my experience, certainly most providers have been providing what we need to see. From an assessment perspective, one of the areas where we would like to see, I guess, more detail is around the assessor's evaluation of e-assessments, and as we've identified, that's a whole challenging area and topic in itself, because often we can actually see the students' assessments, but we actually have difficulty sometimes accessing the assessor's evaluation of that assessment. And sometimes that may have occurred, for example, through a live interaction with a student, and it's happened at point in time, but there hasn't been a record kept of that. So those would probably be the main areas where we would like to see some additional evidence, but it doesn't necessarily involve documentation. It may, for example, involve a recording of some sort.
Thanks very much, Judith. Appreciate your insights on that. Everybody, look, we are very close to time, and we have received a huge number of questions today, which is fantastic. It really underscores the value that everyone sees in this topic that we've been unable to get to inadvertently. So what we will definitely do, though, is our education and guidance team here at ASQA will be going through those questions and having a look at how we can find opportunities going forward to address some of those with you, and it may be indeed that we follow up with some additional activities like this into the new year, but we'll come back to you all on that. So look, thank you very much to everybody for being engaged and for participating today. We do have to wrap up, but I also want to thank our panelists, Judith, Andrew, Tim and Jason, for their respective insights. It's been fantastic, and I feel like it's a topic we could talk about all day if we had the time. So definitely we'll be coming back to the table on this in due course. And look, please also consider that we do have a lot of information on the ASQA website, and also the websites of our guests. Their organisations, of course, have further support information, but we also have the ASQA info line for those who would like to use that and refer that service as well, which is operating from 9 AM to 7 PM Australian Eastern, Monday to Friday. So please consider those avenues as well for further support on this important topic. And as I said, just to recap, if we didn't get to your question today, then rest assured we will be looking at all of them in the background and looking at how we can take those forward into the new year. So thank you once again, a really fascinating discussion. I hope you all got something out of it, and please do fill out the survey form, as I mentioned earlier, which will be coming its way to you now. So panel, thank you very much, and I will sign out for now and wish you all a good afternoon and a safe festive season and new year. Thanks very much.